Now, I get to introduce the third friend of the day. Father Eugene Lauer is a priest of the Diocese of Pittsburgh. Gene, for many of you will know Gene because and may have encountered him in this role, for years headed the Hesburgh program, the renewal and sabbatical program at the University of Notre Dame and then subsequently at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I can say from participation in those sessions over a period of time that Gene was not only an extraordinary host, not only an extraordinary organizer and administrator, but one of the most sensitive, intelligent, and perceptive listeners I know. He is now the director of the National Pastoral Life Office in succession to the late, great Phil Murnian. I can think of no one who would be better in that role that I know of in the Church of the United States than Gene, which is why he has the following impossible task. Everyone else has spoken about a topic. Gene is now going to tell you what everything you heard in the last 48 hours means. Gene.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, yes, my task, as I understand it from the first time that Don called me, is to summarize the main issues that we have heard here, leading to one final concluding point, and that is, what is the charism of the priesthood for the 21st century? And I am to do that summary, of course, from those many different perspectives that were given, from a historical, theological, systematic theological, sacramental, liturgical, sociological, psychological, homiletic, Christian ethical, lay ministerial, and pastoral point of view. Now that's impossible. Only a fool would attempt it. So I'd like to thank all those people who invited me for this role. But I would like to tell you that I will attempt it, and especially because one of my main mentors in doing tasks like this is not my doctoral teachers, none of my pastors, but I spent my first assignments in the priesthood in my home diocese of Pittsburgh in two inner city parishes, one of them all black. The third one was a very elegant white suburban parish. But in that all-black parish in the Hill District, we called it in Pittsburgh, which, by the way, is where Hill Street Blues got its name, because that was written by Pittsburghers. So the Hill District, a fine community. I heard this story. Now, I didn't get to meet the people, but I still consider this old woman one of my mentors. And the story was this, that the local AME, Afro-Methodist Episcopal Church, they had a particularly brilliant young minister. And he was also very street smart and had that great ability that many black preachers have, and I'm sure all of you, even if you've never been in a black church, have heard this, of how the congregation responds and how you evoke that response. And he did that. And I'll expect a little bit of that because actually, I did street preaching in that district for 3 years. And that's when I got my best kind of response from the congregation. Well, this young man was exceptional, and I will expect it here. So exceptional and brilliant that the congregation wanted to send him to get an advanced degree. And they actually raised the money and sent him to Harvard. And he got an MDiv. And he made one beautiful condition. And the condition was he had to come back to the same church, which I really admired. Well, when he came back, he still had the same street smarts. He still had that same grandiose ability to rouse people in the congregation into participation in his homilies. But only one thing changed, they told me, and that was his language. And they said one of his first sermons, and I'm going to try to imitate this, sounded something like this. Brothers and sisters, I sense in this congregation an existential angst. He said, right on, brother, right on. He said, and I see that it is caused by a deep-seated phenomenological challenge. Talk about it, brother, talk about it. And he went on and said, and at the bottom of all this is an eschatological depression. And at that point, an old woman got up in the back and said, Reverend, honey, you better put them cookies on a lower shelf. And that is my task. And I'll begin with the title, The Charism of the Priesthood for the 21st Century. What is a charism? Now, I like to identify this very accurately because I have given one interpretation to it in making my conclusion. Paul said, it's a manifestation of the Spirit for the good of the community, 1 Corinthians, for the good of the Christian community. Good definition. Charism in the theological dictionary reads something like this, that it is an extraordinary power given to a Christian by the Holy Spirit for the building up of the church. Very good also. Standard Dictionary would say something like this, that it is a divinely inspired gift, grace, or talent that leads to a kind of leadership that inspires unswerving allegiance and devotion. And I think all of those three kind of indicate what charism is. And we almost always think of charism as inside people or inside groups of people, inside priests or the priesthood. But I'm going to suggest that the charism of the priesthood for the 21st century is inside the whole consciousness of the faithful. Newman's notion, consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine. It's inside the whole consciousness of what we are experiencing today. A touch of the Spirit that leads us to understand the priesthood. Second clarification as I begin, the word priest. And as almost all of our presenters have done so far, they were very careful to indicate that term, as John Baldwin said, not used in the Scriptures. As several others, in speaking of the history of the church, Tom Groom and Jim Basic, although he didn't refer to it in his presentation, but in his beautifully written paper, said that, of course, at the beginning there were presbyters, elders, overseers, and so on, and cultic priests later on. I will use the word priest uniformly throughout, but to mean that whole evolutionary development. But I will say one thing about the meaning of priest through that whole development that underlies the way that I'm going to come to my conclusion about charism, and it's this. And Bob Imbelli's comment, Bob had to leave early, kind of raised this question a little bit in discussion. Does the word priest mean essentially one who is related to a parish? Or can it mean, the many other tasks that we priests have taken, and especially a lot of us priests here, like myself? Now, I would suggest, in the best of our tradition, the Spirit guiding us through, the word priest, in its best sense, does refer to one who is leader of a local community. I believe that that's root meaning of priest. And anybody else, like me, any theological instructor in a college, must have as basic final interest in some way enhancing or building up the local community or communities. And that's where priesthood gets its ultimate meaning. Okay. So not everybody has to be a pastor, but our interest, as Karl Rahner said, our interest must be in the church as event. And the church as event is most perfectly realized in the local community. And as I'll point out, I think one of the great difficulties in defining priest and dividing its charism was When the priesthood got separated from the local community in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, as Jim Basic again pointed out in his fine paper. Another clarification, my methodology. 3 questions will underlie everything that I am saying and developing, and I won't repeat them as I go along. But the first question is this: what really comes from the Christ event, either from the teachings of Jesus or the impact that Jesus had? What comes from that event that is root to, fundamental to, basic to priesthood? And in taking a look at that, we can say, not that it shouldn't evolve and change, but that that could indeed be the seed from which everything else blossoms and develops. You know, Newman's notion that the evolution of Christian doctrine, the seed at first, and you never know what the flower is going to look like, but the flower should come from the seed. My second question will be, what happened just because of historical circumstances in evolving what priesthood is, that simply came from human decisions? Okay? And certainly many things that happened that way, as Tom Groom pointed out, they could all be changed. Now, the only little modification I would make to what Tom said is, my third question, if something evolved historically, you cannot immediately say, well, we could change it, because some things happened historically because the Spirit was guiding us in genuine biblical unfolding. How do we determine that? The way we usually determine it is by magisterium. Okay? But I think we can do that in a broader sense too, by looking at the sense of the faithful and looking at, does what we have now really coincide with something in the meaning of Jesus' teaching? One other introductory observation. When Dean Hoagie spoke about priest shortage, and this was very interesting to me, in reading his paper and then hearing him speak. When he talked about priest shortage, he said there are 3 ways of looking at it. Do you all recall those right off? If not, then I'll just rehearse your memory. The first one was, in terms of numbers, do we have a priest shortage? And he said, well, you could say yes and no. We used to have 1 priest for every 650 Catholics or so. Now we have 1 for every 1,400. Some people could say that's a shortage. You look at the numbers worldwide, and we still have more priests per Catholic than almost any other place in the world. That's not a shortage. All depends how you look at it. And his second note was, it can also depend on feeling. If you were used to a lot of priests, 3 in your parish, and now you've only got 1, that feeling says there's a shortage, no matter what the numbers say. But his third observation is the one that touched my thesis the most. You recall it. What are priests needed for? And in outlining or trying to develop a charism of priesthood for today, that's the question. The ultimate question, the theological question, and I would suggest also the experiential question. What are priests needed for? And I'm going to try to say that as clearly as I can in the charism. Now, my final observation at the beginning, before I just answer the question that I've been assigned, is, and perhaps this is a bias of mine, but I hope I share it with people like David Tracy and many other theologians. Philosophy is no longer the handmaiden of theology. Now, I don't know where some of my theological colleagues stand there, where many of you, everybody here I'm sure is trained in theology in some way, where you stand on that issue. I am convinced that is no longer true. What is the new handmaiden of theology? And you all know. And if you don't, it is experience. In those first chapters of Blessed Rage for Order, David Tracy, some 25 years ago, kind of outlined how experience really is at the root of understanding first the Word and then the evolution of the Word. Okay. Now, that's certainly absolutely essential to at least the way I will approach this whole issue of what is the charism of priesthood for the 21st century. And by the way, just in a practical sense, I meet this all the time. If you do theology experientially and preach it that way, and I think Tom O'Mara certainly was, in many ways indicating that people sense that you are in this real world. And I was told a true story once, that really indicated that to me in a kind of an oblique way, but it was very interesting. And it was a young priest from a religious order who had grown up kind of in a very rarefied sort of atmosphere, went to the seminary, high school, through college, was ordained, very faithful, but very kind of closed in. So they put him in charge of cars for the community, and he was taking one out one of the first times to get it worked on and inspected. And so he went to the car dealers, and he didn't know any of the process, and they asked him, give me the owner's card and so on, and go in there and wait now for your car. So he did. And he's sitting there trying to look very much part of everything. He has his habit on, by the way. And he's reading a magazine, and he hears suddenly from the loudspeaker, Mr. Reynolds, please pick up your car. Mr. Reynolds, your car. And there's a big truck driver sitting beside him. He said, nobody asked me my name when I came in. How did they know the man's name? He said, oh, it's on your owner's card, son. He said, oh. And he said, I wonder what's on the owner's card. Is it the name of the provincial? Is it the name of our monastery? I wonder what it is. He said, well, I'll recognize it. The voice says, another 2 minutes. Mrs. Montini, please pick up your car. Mrs. Montini. He's sitting there reading his magazine, and suddenly the voice comes over the loudspeaker. Precious blood, your car is ready. Precious blood, please pick up your car. Everybody looks around. His magazine goes up over his face. He says, what am I going to do? So he devises a plan. He said, after a moment or two, he will pretend he's going to the bathroom and then just gradually go over to the desk. And as he starts his plan, he stands up. The voice says, Precious blood, will you please come and get your car? Everybody looks at him. He goes like this, and the big, heavy-set truck driver beside him says, Gee whiz, Precious, I hope they got it right for you. We really do have to be part of the experience of the world to have a credibility in our preaching and in our theology. Now, with that in mind, looking at my first issue that I think is important in moving to this charism from this conference, what do the scriptures and then those early Christian communities say to us in terms of an experiential description of leader of a local community? So, following what Tom Groom and Jim Basic said, and that whole thing about how did Jesus minister, and then how did people after them minister in terms of community. Now, I would suggest, going through all of those papers, there are 5 ingredients to this. And I'm saying this not philosophically, but purely experientially, a description. And I think these are the 5 ingredients that are in that root meaning, and I'll use the word priest in community. And the first is this, and I'll put them in historical order. By the way, my undergraduates who weren't listening always thought I was saying hysterical order, and they never got why it was so banal. And the first was to evangelize. That's the first thing that Jesus had to do. You spread the word, and a community forms. And so the second one is you become overseer or leader and empowerer of those in the community. And that's the second descriptive portion of those initial leaders. And thirdly, if you are empowerer, and I see this as a characteristic of priesthood, although I'm describing the surroundings, it does mean leadership in the midst of a complexus of ministries, as the Pauline letters say very clearly, many different charisms. You can't be doing the whole thing yourself. And as Jim Finley said in one of our workshops today, in between, talking to our psychologist friend about stress and all of those things psychologically and burnout, he said, I'd like to make everybody aware here. When Paul said, be all things to all people, he was lying. Don't do it. You'll drive yourself crazy. So that's the third descriptive characteristic. The fourth, and Tom and Jim and everyone, John Baldwin said this, and naturally flowing from that descriptive reality, from that experiential reality came, you are the one who will lead in worship. You will preside over this community. Now the fifth one, a few of our papers did not emphasize. Some of you did, and I think especially Tom Grimm did. And then Jim Basic in his presentation here. And the fifth one is, and I think it's extremely important, is what kind of person gets chosen? Jim said in his paper, the primary metaphor for leadership in the community is shepherd. Even though we do not live in an agrarian society, still a great metaphor. And you know, something that really told me more about that metaphor than any scripture course I had was a student from Catholic Theological Union who got to go on one of our trips to the Holy Land. She had never been there, of course, first time. And she was taking everything in. They were out in the countryside, and they went to this little, I guess we would call it restaurant, to have some lunch. And there was a big sheepfold beside the restaurant. And she was sitting right beside it, the window, or at least the hole in the wall. And the place was empty. And as it came near noon, a shepherd came along with his flock, talked with the head of the sheepfold, and all of his flock went into the sheepfold, and he came in to get something to eat. And she was kind of wide-eyed. A few minutes later, another shepherd came along, sent all of his 70 or 80 sheep into the sheepfold, paid a few shekels, came in. 4 times it happened. She said, I got nervous. She said, all those sheep mingling, how will they ever get them separated? What does the person do? Well, the first shepherd finished his meal before they did, went out, and she said the experience was remarkable. He talked a moment with the man who was tending the sheepfold, paid him the final payment, turned around, said a word, never looked back, and started walking, and all of the sheep sidled through all the other sheep and came out, and he never looked back once. I know mine, and mine know me. When the sheep hear the shepherd's voice, they follow, and they will not follow the voice of the brigand, because it is not the shepherd's voice. Great description of a pastor. Can all you pastors do that? But seriously, great description. You almost don't need a theology. You need a sense of that experience. In the letter to Titus, we get another description. And by the way, I love some of the English translations of this. Who should be that leader? It should be the husband of one wife. 11 of my 18 classmates are married. They took Titus seriously. And by the way, all faithful Catholics, with one exception. The husband of one wife whose children behave, or examples of good discipline. And then I love the next 3. And it should not be a drunkard, a brawler, or a money grubber. Let all of us pay attention to that, even at the next cocktail hour. Now, I would suggest that those 5 experiential points are essentially what the person and the role of the initial priest was. Well, as we evolve through the development of the tradition, and we have beautiful long histories by many of our presenters on how this happened, I've picked out 3 things that I think diverted somewhat the initial thrust of the seed that is planted in the scriptures and the early Christian communities. But I would suggest that even in that diversion, some truth came. So just one final introductory point, but I thought I would say this one here. Now, I follow, and again, very influenced by David Tracy, and especially the book Blessed Rage for Order, that in terms of what is our teaching and what is our doctrine, there are three levels to the expression of any teaching or any dogma. I'd be interested in any reflection, even from any of my colleagues here who presented papers or anybody, if you follow this or if you really would affirm it. Now, the first level of expression is language. We have to say things in language. It is our only way. Okay. So whether the language is Greek, Hebrew, Latin, or English, we have to say our doctrines in those. We make our final pronouncements in those. But I would suggest, I don't know how you respond to this, all language, biblical, conciliar, papal, can change. There is nothing in language that is ultimate about dogma. Okay, the second layer is philosophical explanation. To give an example, language is transubstantiation. The philosophical explanation is the Aristotelian explanation, substance and accidents, how change can take place, and so on. Philosophical explanation is never our dogma. It can always be changed, even completely. Three persons in one nature is not eternal language. Any language that is philosophical explanation can change. Then what really is the root of dogma? Well, Karl Rahner says it one way, David Tracy says it another way. The ultimate root of any dogma or doctrine is meaning. According to Tracy, or according to Rahner, what does the teaching witness to? In a sense, that can evolve, but that's what cannot change. To use Newman again, simple change means the opposite could be true. Okay, in our dogmas, that root meaning is what flows along and is always with us. So in looking at the development, you see, if we use words like ontological change at ordination, that's philosophical explanation. That can change completely, I think. Almost any language like that comes out of one philosophic tradition can change. But the meaning that it points to is what is crucial, and that's what we should look at. Now, the three incidents or three evolutionary processes that took place and were expounded so well in our presentations that I think are most instructive for getting to the future are, the first one was, when did the notion of priesthood get separated from the local community? As early as the 4th century. As early as the 4th century. You could have ordination and not belong to a local community. And Jim Basic, in his prepared paper, he didn't mention this in his presentation, but I think it's absolutely crucial. He pointed out that even as early as the Council of Chalcedon, and by the way, I love to pronounce it that way rather than Chalcedon, because I had a professor in theology who mispronounced almost all proper names, and we thought he knew loads more than we did. He would talk about St. Jerome, Chalcedon. Oh, and by the way, his classic one was, and I'll never forget this, he had a stuttering way of speaking, and he said, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, virgin and martyr, both of which she became after her death. He said, even as early as Council of Chalcedon 451, stated very clearly that no one can be ordained as deacon or priest, and get the language, in an absolute manner. They cannot be ordained unless they are assigned to a local community. Now, very quickly, that was done away with. Ordination could be, I will make you a sacred person who could celebrate a private mass and bring grace to earth, especially, and I don't say that critically, it was just part of the times, but especially in the monasteries, with all of those altars around, or in the big cathedrals. Okay? Being priest became an extreme value in itself. Now, in my analysis of the way we do theology and doctrine, even though I think that's a real diversion, they were still struggling to get to some basic meaning. Now, here's the meaning that I think is valid inside that, at least a part of that, and that is that this person who is ordained is now in a different position. And the position has a lot to do with the mystery of the divine inside the human. But to say it's a value in itself and so on, it seems to me takes us in the wrong direction. Now, the second change, and it comes from this first, is the use of the language and the development of the philosophy, an ontological change at ordination. That the very being of the person is changed. Now, from an experiential point of view, what could you point to that would indicate a different ontos? Now, what I can point to experientially is a different relationship that's very real. When this person is ordained, they are in a new relational position inside the community. I would suggest that the scholastic language, again highly Aristotelian, of ontological change is not valuable in our culture. But to speak of a relational change really points to something. And the main thing it points to, from the 5 points that I gave you in the scriptures, is this person can now preside. It's one of the main things it points to. And you remember how Tom emphasized that when he was doing his PowerPoint presentation, that however we say it, that still is very distinctive. Now, I was very impressed when Bob Imbelli was talking, brought up a question here up front when somebody was talking about this. I forget in which session, but he said, you know, we've got to make sure we don't go overboard here and say that laity and clergy are the same. I mean, they are distinct, even though it's not a dichotomy. Now, I appreciate that language if distinct and dichotomy means something different to you. They do to me. A relational change makes one distinct. It doesn't make one different in being, but it does make a person distinct. You can do this part of the mission now, this part of the ministry. So I would suggest that we speak in a different way about this in terms of relational difference, but not ontological, being, substance, essence change. Now I have to tell you something about that I think influenced me when I was in my years in theology. And this might sound almost simple or stupid, but remember they invited a fool here to do this, so. When I was getting near my deacon year in the seminary, and of course I had entered at standard age at my 3rd year of college, and I was about 25, 26 years old. I wondered if some of my habits would change. Like I always got a crew cut then. I thought, well, as a priest, that doesn't fit your being. And I really did wonder, would it be right to keep doing that? And then some of my habits about eating, which were a little bit eccentric, you know, about natural foods and so on. I thought, well, should I eat like the people or something? There was something so ingrained in that seminary tradition that I thought, my being is going to change. And I'll never forget on ordination day, I said to the guy beside me, do you feel the same? It was a really interesting experience. Now, a very immature one, but a really interesting one of how that theology was really touching me in a real way. But if somebody would have said to me, are you relationally different? When I went back to my neighborhood and all those old people came up and said, Father, it's great to see you. I looked around to see who they're talking to because I was in a different relationship to that inner city neighborhood in the Homewood Brushton, inner city, part black section of Pittsburgh. That was real, very real. The third phenomenon in the evolution that I've chosen that I think indicates something that both diverts us but shows us the direction of meaning is the question of passing on of spiritual power. Is spiritual power passed on? Now, once again, as all theology, that's metaphorical or analogous language. Nobody can examine, investigate experientially power that's spiritual. It's a way of speaking. What is the meaning that that points to? Now, I would suggest the meaning that it points to is this: that I am now commissioned or mandated to do something that the rest of the faithful who have not gone through this commissioning service called ordination cannot do, must not do. They cannot do. To call that power sounds too controlling. It sounds like too much like we're making it into a commodity. To say that I am designated, commissioned in my new relational role in the community, it seems to me speaks of the experience much more accurately and gets us out of a lot of problems. Because the unbroken line, then, if you just think about it in a moment, doesn't make that much difference. I mean, if you get a real designation, a commission, then you do it. Okay? Now, here's a fascinating thing to me about this. When the Protestant tradition challenged that notion of passing on spiritual power, now, you know, they kept ordination, and they wanted ministers, and the ministers had Eucharist and so on, but they said, just as Tertullian said in the 2nd century, as Jim Basic pointed out again, that Tertullian said in an emergency, well, anybody could preside. Well, you know, in the Protestant tradition, most of the mainstream churches say anyone could preside at Eucharist, you know, if the pastor goes on vacation or whatever, okay? I worked with the World Council of Churches for a while in the Pittsburgh area. I was in a lot of ecumenical gatherings. This is not good data, Dean, but at least it's good anecdotal data. In all of those conversations, I asked, because I get interested in this, how many times have you experienced in your community a lay person, like when the pastor was on vacation, conducting a Eucharist? And you know what the answer was? I never found one person who said they had that experience. So even without a theology of spiritual power, isn't it interesting, experientially, that the designation in the Protestant tradition is almost the same as the designation in the Catholic community? That really means something to me now. It says something about those who are doing the ministry and who are leaders in every way are the ones who preside and are designated to do so. And in the one case, we said it's because of this internal change and power came, and they said because of designation. But the same experiential reality evolved. Well, in the light of that, I would like to say now, how would I define, how would I describe the charism of the priesthood for the 21st century? As I indicated, for me, it is not a special spiritual gift given to individual priests or the priesthood. It is the Spirit giving a gift to the whole consciousness of the community today that this assembly illustrated so well in so many of the talks. And here's the way I would indicate it, and I'll say it in 2 or 3 different ways. It is a special gift of the Spirit within the whole of the church, a gift of a vision whereby we see the fullness of ordained priesthood only and completely in the light of the dramatic development of the priesthood of the faithful. It is a special gift of the Spirit that gives us an awareness that we can understand inside the matrix of the universal priesthood of the faithful the specific and full meaning of the ordained priesthood. Now, Tom Groom, Jim Basic, Ed Honenberg all said that so well with their concentric circles. Well, Jim didn't use concentric circles, but the same idea. That we have the universal priesthood of the faithful, and I will call that universal ministry of the faithful. And as Ed pointed out, again so strongly, that to distinguish between apostolate and ministry seems to be an attempt to control experience by changing language. And we simply will not have it in our tradition. They are lay ecclesial ministers. not apostolate people. It happened. It has changed. Now, that vision, inside the consciousness of all the faithful, and I am making the assumption, which is the touch of the Spirit, which is the charism about priesthood in the 21st century, is what I think will lead us to the future of ministry inside the Catholic tradition. Now, I'll say several, again, descriptive characteristics about that consciousness. What will it lead to? And I'll try to say it in a very practical way and not in a philosophical way. Okay? First, the concentric circles, I think, is a great way to express it. Here is the whole priesthood of the faithful, and some are chosen, and I think Ed used this language. They are chosen to be ordained, and through their ordination and now their presiding ministry, the fullness of the whole ministry is brought to fruition. Okay, secondly, here is a very interesting experiential thing. I've worked with a lot of lay ministers recently for many different reasons. And I think many of you know our National Pastoral Life Center just finished the third phase of a 15-year study on lay ministry. And it will be published in November, by the way, just to whet your appetite. Fascinating things we discovered about lay ministry. If a lay minister visits a hospital and a person has great prayer experience and feels close to Jesus, and the priest visits a hospital and that person has a great prayer experience and feels close to Jesus, is there any difference that makes any difference about those two experiences? I'll say it further because this came up. If a parent gives a blessing and the child feels a little swept up in God, and the priest gives a blessing and the child feels a little swept up in God, is there any actual difference that makes any difference in those experiences? We could philosophize and say, well, the one is ritually more pure or something. But isn't it true that so many things we said in the Catechism did not touch us? I did my doctoral dissertation on Newman. I love some of his quips. I'll never forget this one. He said, I do not doubt the validity of philosophical argument. I only sometimes doubt its value. Now, I don't mean that as a sweeping comment. Philosophy is a very valuable thing. But in terms of ministry, and especially in terms of theology, theology is more an experiential reality, I believe, than it is a philosophic reality, because it has to do with salvation and conversion and real meaning in life. Okay, the third thing, then, that I think I can say is that most ministries, maybe virtually all except presiding, are being done by lay ministers today, except for presiding. And I think Tom Groom, said that in a similar way. If you look at what lay ministers are doing, they're doing almost everything I did in my first assignment as associate pastor, except for presiding. They're doing it better than I did in some cases. There is a greater spiritual touch with the divine in some cases. Now, if that is true, if that's an accurate analysis of experience, here's a very interesting reflection. If lay ministers are doing all these ministries that unite, empower the community, and in our most ancient tradition, those are the people who were designated for ministry, will the next logical push of the Spirit be that these are the people who will be designated, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, who will be designated to preside? If, in a sense, I'm oversimplifying this, they are doing everything in ministry except presiding. There was another reflection on that. Richard McBrien pointed out once that when we talked about minor orders, as Susan did in her beginning talk, and she talked about it as the cursus honoris, one of the ways, or cursus honorum, some would say, which meant the course on the way to priesthood of honor So you get to be lector and exorcist and acolyte and so on. It leads to priesthood. McBrien pointed out that certain times in our history, it was not at all automatic as it was when I was in the seminary. You know what it was, he maintains? It was a way of seeing who could do it best. And those who were doing the lector or acolyte part pretty well, they said those are the better candidates. I find a fascinating comparison that's real and experiential to lay ministry. We have 35,000 lay ministers, professionals, in our parishes today. And according to our recent survey, by the way, 48% of them have master's degrees. Not all in divinity and so on, but in related fields, some of them in sociology or whatever. Could you envision that as an enormous pool for ordination? We would not need to ordain 35,000 presiders today. We don't have that need. Are they the excellent candidates? Imagine having your choice, having your pick among, and this is the key thing, among ministers who have already proven themselves. When I was ordained, they didn't know what I was going to do. But isn't that true? I mean, I had 2 years of internship, and actually one of the more enlightened seminary programs in the country at St. Mary's, Baltimore, back in the 60s, where we did ministry every year, all 4 years. But still, I was not part of a local community the way they are. Isn't it true? It could be a testing place for where are not just the best vocations, but the proven ones, the people we could depend on. My final observation, and here I'm going to try to pretend to be a little bit like Dean Hoagie, but I won't be anywhere near as glib. He is so good at that. Okay? I'll just say it academically. Okay? We have 35,000 lay ministers in the United States today attached to parishes. Most of them full-time, a small percentage part-time. All of them prepared in some way, some better than others, but many, many of them, okay, having very fine preparation. We have 15,000 permanent deacons who went through programs from 3 to 5 years in length. Okay, that's 50,000 people. Add that to the number of priests we still have ministering in parishes. I think Dean Hoagie said something like 19,000 or so. Now, take that number of people who are ministering to our parishes at this very moment and do as Dean Hoagie did, dividing the priests into that number, divide all the ministers into that number. Now, I know I'm going to be somewhat off on this, Dean, and I'd love it if you would do this more scientifically. The ratio comes out to something like 1 to 480 Catholics. That's a dramatic insight to me. Is the Spirit telling us something in this charism, this gift of the Spirit? 1 to about, and I'm sure that's going to be off, but it's going to be dramatically smaller. And so the question I would ask is this, and I just wrote a little article on this for Church Magazine. Are our parishes being better ministered today by that number of permanent deacons, priests, and lay ministers than they were at the heyday of ordination in 1950? Are they really? So I will conclude then with another insight from a mentor of mine, and this one happens to be an old woman who was at my mother's nursing home. I discovered when you get older, and I'm getting older, I discovered that very often, you know, you really do get the ability to say things maybe a little more toughly or bluntly and just say them straightforward. And I wonder how much more bluntly we should talk about. And I would say, I don't say anymore the ordination of married people or the ordination of women. What I say is the ordination of those who are already ministering, prepared for ministry. Makes more sense that way. Okay? Say it bluntly. Well, this old woman at my mother's nursing home, she was wonderful. She had been a professional woman, and every time they had a little event at the nursing home, she'd get dressed up in a suit, heels, nylons, looked like $1 million, and she was 90 years old. The St. Vincent de Paul Society was having a cocktail hour for these old people, and that was always just a hoot. It was wonderful. So she came dressed up and everything and came over to the St. Vincent de Paul Society guy, you know, the bartender. Now, he's like 68 years old or so. And she comes up, And many of you will remember how the real old people used to measure their drinks by fingers. I want 2 fingers of scotch or whatever. She comes over and says, very professionally, "Sonny boy, give me 3 fingers of scotch and 1 finger of water." And he looks up and smiles, kind of, patronizing. Says, "Grandma," he said, "no, this is strong stuff. Don't you mean 3 fingers of water and 1 finger of scotch?" She looked and said, "Look, Sonny boy, I'm 90 years old and I know my own body. I can hold my liquor, but I can't hold my water. Now give me 3 fingers of scotch and 1 finger of water." Perhaps it's time to be more blunt in the church.